The Ancient City, Book 4, Chapter 8, Changes in Private Law, the Code of the 12 Tables, the Code of Solon. It is not in the nature of law to be absolute and unchangeable. It is modified and transformed, like every human work. Every society has its laws, which are formulated and developed with it, which change with it, and which, in fine, always follow the movements of its institutions, its manners, and its religious beliefs. Men of the early ages had been governed by a religion which influenced their minds in proportion to its rudeness. This religion had made their law, and had given them their political institutions. But finally society was transformed. The patriarchal rule which this hereditary religion had produced was dissolved, with a lapse of time, in the rule of the city. Insensibly the gens was dismembered. The younger members separated from the older, the servant from the chief. The inferior class increased. It took arms, and finished by vanquishing the aristocracy, and conquering equal rights. This change in the social state necessarily brought another in law, for as strongly as the eupatrids and patricians were attached to the old family religion, and consequently to ancient law, just so strongly were the lower classes opposed to this religion, which had long caused their inferiority, and to this ancient law, which had oppressed them. Not only did they detest it, but they did not even understand it. As they had not the belief on which it was founded, this law appeared to them to be without foundation. They found it unjust, and from that time it became impossible for the law to maintain its ground. If we place ourselves back to the time when the plebs had increased and entered the body politic, and compare the law of this epoch with primitive law, grave changes appear at the first glance. The first and most salient is that the law has been rendered public and is known to all. It is no longer that sacred and mysterious chant which men repeated with pious respect from age to age, which priests alone wrote, and which men of the religious families alone could know. The law has left the rituals and the books of the priests. It has lost its religious mystery. It is a language which each one can read and speak. Something still more important is manifest in these codes. The nature of the law and its foundation are no longer the same as in the preceding period. Formerly, the law was a religious decision. It passed for a revelation made by the gods to the ancestors, to the divine founder, to the sacred kings, to the magistrate priests. In the new code, on the contrary, the legislator no longer speaks in the name of the gods. The decemvirs of Rome receive their powers from the people. The people also invested Solon with the right to make laws. The legislator, therefore, no longer represents religious tradition, but popular will. The principle of the law, henceforth, is the interest of men, and its foundation, the consent of the greatest number. Two consequences flow from this fact. The first is that the law is no longer presented as an immutable and undisputable formula. As it becomes a human work, it is acknowledged to be subject to change. The 12 Tables say, "What the votes of the people have ordained in the last instance is the law." Of all the passages of this code that remain to us, there is not one more important than this, or one which better marks the character of the revolution that had then taken place in the law. The law was no longer a sacred tradition, mos. It was simply a text, lex, and as the will of men had made it, the same will could change it. The other consequence is this. The law, which before had been a part of religion, and was consequently the patrimony of the sacred families, was now the common property of all the citizens. The plebeian could plead in the courts. At most, the Roman patrician, more tenacious or more cunning than the eupatriot of Athens, attempted to conceal the legal procedure from the multitude, but even these forms were not long in being revealed. Thus the law was changed in its nature. From that time it could no longer contain the same provisions as in the preceding period. So long as religion had controlled it, it had regulated the relations of men to each other according to the principles of this religion. But the inferior class, who brought other principles into the city, understood nothing of the old rules of the right of property, or of the ancient right of succession, or of the absolute authority of the father, or of the relationship of agnation, and wished to do away with all that. This transformation of the law, it is true, could not be accomplished at once. If it is sometimes possible for man quickly to change his political institutions, he cannot change his legislation and his private law except slowly and by degrees. The history of Roman law, as well as that of Athenian law, proves this. The 12 tables, as we have seen above, were written in the midst of social changes. Patricians made them, but they were made upon the demand of the plebs and for their use. This legislation, therefore, is no longer the primitive law of Rome, neither is it Praetorian law. It is a transition between the two. Here, then, are the points in which it does not yet deviate from the antique law. It maintains the power of the father. It allows him to pass judgment upon his son, to condemn him to death or to sell him. While the father lives, the son never reaches his majority. As to the law of succession, this also follows the ancient rules. The inheritance passes to the agnates, and in default of agnates, to the gentiles. As to the cognates, that is to say, those related through females, the law does not yet recognize them. They do not inherit from each other. The mother does not succeed to the son, nor the son to the mother. Emancipation and adoption preserve the character and effects which these acts had in antique law. The emancipated son no longer takes part in the worship of his family, and, as a consequence, he loses the right of succession. The following points are those on which this legislation deviates from primitive law. It formally admits that the patrimony may be divided among the brothers, since it grants the actio familiae erescundae. It declares that the father cannot sell his son more than 3 times, and that after the 3rd sale the son shall be free. This is the first blow struck by Roman law at the paternal authority. Another change, still more important, was that which gave a man the right to transmit his property by will. Before this period, the son was a self-successor and a necessary. In default of sons, the nearest agnate inherited. In default of agnates, the property returned to the gens. A trace of the time when the gens, still undivided, was sole proprietor of the domain, which afterwards had been divided. The 12 tables threw aside those old principles. They treated property as belonging not to the gens, but to the individual. They therefore recognized in man the right of disposing of his property by will. Still, the will was not entirely unknown in primitive law. Even then a man might choose a legatee outside the gens, but on the condition that his choice should be ratified by the assembly of the curies, so that nothing less than the entire city could change the order which religion had formerly established. The new legislation freed the will from this vexatious rule, and gave it a more convenient form, that of a pretended sale. The man feigned to sell his property to the one whom he had chosen as heir. In reality he made a will. In this case he had no need of appearing before the assembly of the people. This form of will had the great advantage of being permitted to the plebeians. He who had nothing in common with the Curies had, up to that time, found no means of making a will. But now he could employ the process of a pretended sale and dispose of his property. The most remarkable fact in this period of the history of Roman legislation is that by the introduction of certain new forms, the law extended its action and its benefits to the inferior orders. Ancient rules and formalities had only been applicable and were still applied only to religious families. But new rules and new methods of procedure were prepared, which were applicable to the plebeians. For the same reason, and in consequence of the same needs, innovations were introduced into that part of the law which related to marriage. It is clear that the plebeian families did not contract the sacred marriage, and that for them the conjugal union rested only upon the mutual agreement of the parties, mutuus consensus, and on the affection which they had promised each other, affectio maritalis. No formality, religious or civil, took place. This plebeian marriage finally prevailed in custom and in law. But in the beginning the laws of the patrician city did not recognize it as at all binding. This fact had important consequences. As the marital and paternal authority in the eyes of the patricians flowed only from the religious ceremony which had initiated the wife into the worship of the husband, it followed that the plebeian had not this power. The law recognized no family as his, and for him private law did not exist. This was a situation that could not last. A formality was therefore devised for the use of the plebeians, which, in civil affairs, had the same effect as the sacred marriage. They had recourse, as in case of the will, to a fictitious sale. The wife was bought by the husband, coemptio. From that time she was recognized in law as a part of his property, familia. She was in his hands, and ranked as his daughter, absolutely as if the religious ceremony had been performed. We cannot affirm that this proceeding was not older than the 12 Tables. It is at least certain that the new legislation recognized it as legitimate. It thus gave the plebeian a private law, which was analogous in its effects to the law of the patricians, though it differed widely in principle. Usus corresponds to coemptio. These are two forms of the same act. Every object may be acquired in either of two ways, by purchase or by use. The same is the case with the fictitious property in the wife. Use here was 1 year's cohabitation. It established between husband and wife the same legal ties as purchase or the religious ceremony. It is hardly necessary to add that the cohabitation was to be preceded by marriage, at least by the plebeian marriage, which was contracted by the consent and affection of the parties. Neither the coemptio nor the usus created a moral union between husband and wife. They came after marriage, merely established a legal right. These were not, as has been too often repeated, modes of marriage. They were only means of acquiring the marital and paternal power. But the marital authority of ancient times had consequences, which, at the epoch of history to which we have arrived, began to appear excessive. We have seen that the wife was subjected without reserve to the husband, and that the power of the latter went so far that he could alienate or sell her. In another point of view, the power of the husband also produced effects which the good sense of the plebeian could hardly comprehend. Thus, the woman placed in the hands of her husband was separated absolutely from her paternal family. She inherited none of its property, and had no tie of relationship with it in the eyes of the law. This was very well in primitive law, when religion forbade the same person to belong to 2 gentes, or to sacrifice at 2 hearths, or inherit from 2 houses. But the power of the husband was no longer conceived to be so great, and there were several excellent motives for wishing to escape these hard consequences. The Code of the 12 Tables, while providing that a year's cohabitation should put the wife in the husband's power, was compelled to leave him the liberty of contracting a union less binding. If each year the wife interrupted the cohabitation by an absence of no more than 3 nights, it was sufficient to prevent the husband's power from being established. Thus the wife preserved a legal connection with her own family and could inherit from it. Without entering into further details, we see that the Code of the 12 Tables already departed considerably from primitive law. Roman legislation was transformed with the government and the social state. Little by little, and in almost every generation, some new change took place. As the lower classes progressed in political order, new modifications were introduced into the rules of law. First, marriage was permitted between patrician and plebeian. Next, it was the Papirian law which forbade the debtor to pledge his person to the creditor. The procedure became simplified, greatly to the advantage of the plebeian, by the abolition of the actions of the law. Finally, the praetor, continuing to advance in the road which the 12 Tables had opened, traced out, by the side of the ancient law, an entirely new system, which religion did not dictate, and which approached continually nearer to the law of nature. An analogous revolution appears in Athenian law. We know that 2 codes were prepared at Athens, with an interval of 30 years between them, the first by Draco, the second by Solon. The Code of Draco was written when the struggle of the 2 classes was at its height, and before the Eupatrids were vanquished. Solon prepared his at the moment when the inferior class gained the upper hand. The difference between these codes, therefore, is great. Draco was a Eupatrid. He had all the sentiments of his caste, and was learned in the religious law. He appears to have done no more than to reduce the old customs to writing, without in any way changing them. His first law is this: men should honor the gods and heroes of the country and offer them annual sacrifices without deviating from the rites followed by our ancestors. Memorials of his laws concerning murder have been preserved. They prescribe that the guilty one shall be kept out of the temple and forbid him to touch the lustral water or the vessels used in the ceremonies. His laws appeared cruel to succeeding generations. They were indeed dictated by an implacable religion which saw in every fault an offense against the divinity, and in every offense against the divinity an unpardonable crime. Theft was punished with death, because theft was an attempt against the religion of property. A curious article of this legislation, which has been preserved, shows in what spirit it was made. It grants the right of prosecution for a murder only to the relatives of the dead and members of his gens. We see by this how powerful the gens still was at that period, since it did not permit the city to interfere in its affairs, even to avenge it. A man still belonged to the family more than to the city. In all that has come down to us of this legislation, we see that it does no more than reproduce the ancient law. It had the severity and inflexible character of the old unwritten law. We can easily believe that it established a very broad distinction between the classes, for the inferior class always detested it, and at the end of 30 years demanded a new code. The Code of Solon is entirely different. We can see that it corresponded to a great social revolution. The first peculiarity we remark in it is that the laws are the same for all. They establish no distinction between the Eupatrids, the simple freemen, and the Thetes. These names are not even found in any of the articles that have been preserved. Solon boasts in his verses of having written the same laws for the great and the small. Like the 12 Tables, the Code of Solon departed in many points from the ancient law. On other points he remained faithful to it. This is not to say that the Roman decemvirs copied the laws of Athens, but the 2 codes, works of the same period and consequences of the same social revolution, could not but resemble each other. Still, this resemblance is little more than in the spirit of the two codes. A comparison of their articles presents numerous differences. There are points on which the Code of Solon remains nearer to the primitive law than the 12 Tables, as there are others on which he departs more widely from it. The very early laws had prescribed that the eldest son alone should inherit. The Code of Solon changed this and prescribed in formal terms that the brothers should share the patrimony. But the legislator did not depart from primitive law enough to give the sister a part in the inheritance. The division, he says, shall be among the sons. Further, if a father left only a daughter, this daughter could not inherit. The property fell to the nearest agnate. In this, Solon conformed to the old law, but he succeeded in giving the daughter the enjoyment of the patrimony by compelling the heir to marry her. Relationship through women was unknown in the primitive law. Solon admitted it in the new code, but placed it below the relationship through males. Here is his law. If a father leaves only a daughter, the nearest agnate inherits by marrying the daughter. If he leaves no children, his brother inherits, and not his sister, his brother by the same father, and not his uterine brother. In default of brothers and the sons of brothers, the succession falls to the sister. If there are neither brothers, nor sisters, nor nephews, the cousins and the children of cousins inherit. If no cousins are found in the paternal branch, that is to say, among the agnates, the succession is conferred on the collaterals of the maternal branch, the cognates. Thus, women began to enjoy rights of inheritance, but rights inferior to those of men. The law formally declared this principle. Males and the descendants through males exclude women and the descendants of women. But this sort of relationship was recognized and took its place in the laws, a certain proof that natural right began to speak almost as loud as the ancient religion. Solon also introduced into Athenian legislation something entirely new, the will. Before him, property passed necessarily to the nearest agnate, or, in default of agnates, to the genites, gentiles. This was because goods were considered as belonging not to the individual, but to the family. But in Solon's time, men began to take another view of the right of property. The dissolution of the old genos had made every domain the property of an individual. The legislator, therefore, permitted them to dispose of their fortunes and to choose their legatees. Still, while suppressing the rights which the genos had over each of its members, he did not suppress the rights of the natural family. The son remained the necessary heir. If the deceased left only a daughter, he could choose his heir only on condition that this heir should marry the daughter. A man without children was free to will his property according to his fancy. This last rule was absolutely new in Athenian legislation, and we can see by this how many new ideas concerning the family sprang up at that time. The primitive religion had given the father sovereign authority in his own house. The ancient law of Athens went so far as to permit a father to sell his son or to put him to death. Solon, conforming to new manners, limited this power. It is certainly known that he forbade a father to sell his daughter, and it is probable that the same injunction protected the son. The paternal authority went on diminishing as the ancient religion lost its power, an event which happened earlier at Athens than at Rome. The Athenian law, therefore, was not satisfied to say, like the 12 Tables, after a triple sale the son shall be free. It permitted the son, on reaching a certain age, to escape from the paternal power. Custom, if not the laws, insensibly came to establish the majority of the son during the lifetime of his father. There was an Athenian law which enjoined the son to support his father when old or infirm. Such a law necessarily indicates that the son might own property, and consequently that he was freed from parental authority. This law did not exist at Rome, because the son never possessed anything and always remained a minor. As for females, the law of Solon still conformed to the earlier law when it forbade her to make a will, because a woman was never a real proprietor and could have only the usufruct. But it deviated from the ancient code when it permitted women to claim their dower. There were still other innovations in this code. In opposition to Draco, who permitted only the family of the victim to prosecute for a crime, Solon granted this right to every citizen. Here was one more old patriarchal right abolished. Thus at Athens, as at Rome, law began to undergo a change. For the new social state, a new code sprang up. Beliefs, manners, and institutions having been modified, laws which had before appeared just and wise ceased to appear so, and by slow degrees were abolished.